This tablet in my hand, like almost everything produced, is the product of global networks of extraction and exploitation, from the mining of so-called conflict minerals in the DRC for its electronic components, to the assembly of its parts in notoriously harsh Chinese factories, to its transportation across the world and its marketing in the global north. Each stage adds value, which flows upwards towards the imperial core, US, UK, Germany, wherever it was conceived of, and often when it was designed, places in the global north. These chains of value extraction are coordinated in the global north for the primary benefit of us in the imperial nations. And this has been a key dynamic of neoliberal capitalism, and one which has reinforced the racialized global division of labour. Global value chains are predicated on the super exploitation of low-wage labour in the global south, which is only made possible by a global racial regime which marks some people as more exploitable, more expendable than others. Cheap is another word for violent. The only way we in the global north can happily go about our business with phones and tablets and coffee and food, which is the product of exploitation and death, is because we only relate to commodities themselves, not the exploitation and death which is essential to their production. This is why, for Marx, we have to examine the hidden abode of production to understand the workings of capitalism rather than just the appearance of exchange on the market. But iPads aren't the only things produced violently. There is another hidden abode that is essential to capitalism, which likewise reproduces racial and gender divisions of labour, obscuring workers as people, but which is only lightly touched upon by Marx. This is the hidden abode that reproduces our very lives, the hidden abode of social reproduction. So social reproduction refers to the multiple processes by which workers and the conditions for the system as a whole are reproduced both daily and generationally. So, how do you get up every day versus how do we produce a new generation of workers? This can happen in several ways. It can refer to the immediate caring labour, which is disproportionately done by women within the household in combination with the cost of commodities consumed by workers every day to just keep them alive and able to work day after day.
Research shows there is still inequality at home, with women taking on most household responsibilities. One of the New York Times most shared articles this week is called "What Good Dads Get Away With." We like that title. It unpacks why women still handle most of the child care and chores. One study estimates it will be, listen to this, another 75 years before men do half the unpaid work at home.
But it can also refer to more public work like education or healthcare or cleaning, all of which is essential to the systemic reproduction of the working classes as a whole. And this work is often also gendered and racialized. So while neoliberal capitalism inaugurated a period of globalized production and these global value chains, less often talked about is that it also globalised this social reproductive labour too. It created what feminists have called global care chains. This video is an introduction to this essential process of neoliberal capitalism, which I think is a linchpin around which global fascism has been organising. Social reproductive labour is frequently either unwaged, or when it is waged, it's very precarious and extremely undervalued. And in fact, it has been estimated that women's unpaid domestic labour accounts for more than half of the world's total labour output, while the total value of this labour has been estimated at over $10 trillion annually. And this devaluing of women's domestic labour is made possible as a further hidden abode of capitalist production by the naturalisation of women as caregivers, as natural caregivers.
Does your husband do housework?
He does his bits and pieces, yes.
What's he do?
Washes up, makes his bed now and again, wipes the sink round.
Does he do it as good as you do?
Oh, no. You don't expect a man to. You don't expect a man
Why
to.
not?
Because it's just not in him to do it. Not unless he's been trained for it. We're trained for it from that, aren't we?
Everyone's heard, misogynistic claims about women being natural caregivers, naturally better at looking after children or the elderly, or just naturally better friends, naturally more caring. This sort of stuff is foundational ideological work which maintains this gender division of labour. While productive labour is masculinised and given value on the labour market, women have frequently been hidden in the home, and their labour, which is an essential precondition to capitalist production itself, isn't understood as labour at all, just care. Commodity fetishism, by which we hide the violence of production, also devalues the very existence of reproduction. And this undervaluing of household labour arguably lays the foundation for the undervaluing of waged reproductive labour too. You know, people undervalue childcare because it's not real work. It's just something that you need to get someone to do, look after a kid, because this is just natural compunction of women. And that sort of justifies undervaluing and providing low wages for people in those sectors. But this isn't a totally simple story for black and racialized women across the globe. There's never really been a period where they were not forced to work in others' households, whether as domestic slaves or as massively underpaid household staff. As Patricia Hill Collins argues, the assumed split between the public sphere of paid employment and the private sphere of unpaid family responsibilities has never worked for US black women. But this doesn't undermine the analysis that unpaid social reproduction is a precondition to capitalist production, but it allows us a glimpse of just how racialized the exporting of reproductive labour outside the bounds of the family has been throughout history. So with these two features of social reproductive labour sketched out, that's the unwaged household labour and the frequently racialised waged reproductive labour, we can return to neoliberalism and the creation of global care chains. So central to the transition into neoliberalism was the breakup and disciplining of organised labour. You know, we frequently talk about the Thatcher's war against the miners or Reagan's war against the air traffic control unions as inaugural moments of destroying worker power to produce neoliberalism. But another part of this process was the exporting of production to the global south, where labour could be super exploited and the power of labour in the imperial core reeled in. You know, we no longer require producers because it's been exported. And these previously industrial, organised industrial capacities, industries are broken up and their power diminished.
So Manchester, of course, is a city with an amazing past. It was the city at the heart of the Industrial Revolution, and it was a city like so many industrial cities that encountered relatively difficult times during the 1960s and 1970s. Tell us what Manchester was like when you started in city government in the 1970s.
Manchester probably at that stage was a textbook analysis of how not to adapt your economy to the growing trend of globalisation. So my predecessors witnessed sectors like manufacturing, production, effectively be repatriated to other parts of the world, notably the Far East, which effectively left Manchester a legacy of industrial dereliction on a very significant scale.
And a further aspect of this process of breaking up the power of organised labour was the activation of sections of the so-called reserve army of ununionised labour. This reserve army of labour was pushed into the labour market to drive down real wages and cripple the bargaining power of organised labour. And a large section of this ununionised labour was from white women who were previously confined to the household. Suddenly, from 1980s, women from almost every section of society were encouraged into the workforce. But simultaneously, state-led forms of social reproduction such as public childcare, healthcare, welfare and education were privatised. This meant that poor working class women were made responsible for both waged work, they were pushed into the labour market, and in the household, they were still responsible for unwaged social reproductive labour. For middle class and richer women, these social reproductive duties could be exported to the realm of the market.
Almost all the carers at this South London home were born outside the UK. The care sector has long faced staff shortages, and bosses here believe migrant workers are essential.
Domestic cleaners and carers could be hired to lift the social reproductive burden and allow wealthier women the freedom to lean in, enter the labour market and break the glass ceiling.
Well, they say you can't have it all, but Sheryl Sandberg comes awfully close. At 43, Sandberg, who is a director at Disney, ABC's parent company, is the highly respected chief operating officer of Facebook, putting her net worth in the billions. She's also happily married with 2 young children, and yet she wants even more, specifically women, to join her in the professional stratosphere. She calls it leaning in, gunning for the corner office, not the cubicle.
And importantly, while women entered the workplace, the social force of patriarchal divisions of labour weren't abolished, but transformed, marketised, and often intensified. And there were various problems with this arrangement, which, shockingly, too extensive to fully describe here. But there's a couple of things that I do want to draw your attention to, some essential aspects that were produced by this process. Firstly, for poor women who could not afford to hire help, they were unable to both work and care full-time. And this has led to a wearing away of the basis upon which social reproduction can occur, and has been labelled by Marxist feminists like Nancy Fraser as one of the features of global capitalism's general crisis of care. Those women who could not work due to caring responsibility have been consistently demonised across neoliberal states as feckless single mothers having too many kids, or as racialised welfare queens causing the systemic rot at the core of society.
In the UK, 1 in 4 families are headed by a single parent, and 90% of those single parents are women. But in our society, the phrase single mother seems to be synonymous with bad mother. In the aftermath of the riots of 2011, David Cameron said,
"I don't doubt that many of the rioters out last week had no dad at home."
This lazy and insulting explanation does nothing to try and understand the complex reasons behind the unrest. And this year, Owen Lovell, town mayor of Lyme Regis, stated that morally behaved people should be placed ahead of single mothers on housing lists, insinuating that being a single mother and a good person are mutually exclusive.
And this is a discourse which has arguably led to a hardening of misogynistic and racist politics. But the other problem of this neoliberalisation of women's labour was that there just weren't enough low-waged workers to fill the gaps in the global north, to fill these care gaps. And this led to a massive project of feminised labour migration from the global south into the global north, as racialised women were encouraged to take low-waged reproductive roles in the households of those women who could manage their reproductive responsibilities via the market, those wealthier women who could lean in. According to the ILO, an estimated 67 million adult domestic workers are employed worldwide, of whom 80% are women. 80%. And 66% of domestic workers in high-income countries are migrant workers. So migration, feminised migration, has been a massive project under neoliberalism to fill in these care gaps, the systemic wearing away of the conditions of reproduction.
Whether you're from Jamaica, you're from India, you're from Philippines, all of those countries, we're here to make up that gap, which like at home people, most time they don't want to do it, or they're not doing it. So it's like, it will be in trouble if we are not here.
This colonial solution to the housework problem kept the feminised migrant labour force in increasingly precarious and violent conditions by hardening global border regimes which suppresses wages and stops such workers from organising collectively. You know, if you are a low-paid worker, dependent on an employment visa to work, you are at the mercy of employers every second of every day, not just in the workplace, but every second of every day. So, in creating this system, this regime cemented both global racial class divisions and internal class divisions between those women who can hire help and those who can't. You know, you can see how just as in global value chains, some populations are labelled expendable and exploitable, those racialised populations, so too in these global care chains, certain migrant women, racial migrant women, are defined as exploitable and expendable in their own sense. Racial and gender divisions are maintained in these specific aspects of an overall neoliberal regime. And this is the case even for apparently progressive cases like Canada, which has been described as an outlier in an increasingly anti-migrant world and characterised as one of the most progressive environments for migrants in the world.
In recent decades, my home country, Canada, has had the image of a successful and accepting nation, welcoming millions of upwardly mobile immigrants.
You know, immigration in Canada is not just something that we do, it's who we are. It's who we've always been.
But in the face of rising poverty, a housing crisis, and an influx of more than 1 million people last year alone, anti-immigrant sentiment is now growing, with 60% of Canadians now saying it's too high.
In Canada, there have been horrendous programs of migrant domestic labour. Canada's Live-in Domestic Care Programme, or the LCP, was a scheme through which the Canadian government managed this ongoing crisis of care, this wearing away of the social basis of reproduction, not through funding universal childcare, but by employing cheap migrant labour to fill care gaps. This scheme encouraged migrant women, mostly from the Philippines, to gain a, quote, pathway to residency through either 24-hour live-in care work or a 2-year period of domestic work for a Canadian home. And this obviously created horrendous conditions for migrant women within the households to which they were assigned. And it's been described, these conditions have been described as akin to slave-like conditions because of the abuse and overwork, because household employers held so much power over racialised domestic workers that they could threaten them with deportations and subject them to conditions of just absurd super exploitation. And while legally domestic workers were supposed to work only 8 hours a day, one worker reported that they were frequently working from 7 a.m. to midnight whenever the employer demanded it. The overwhelming power imbalances in cases like this just demonstrate how devaluing the border is as a tool of organising racialised and gendered labour. The border lets this happen. The border is the prime tool for making this happen. And let me remind you, Canada is held up as a golden example of progressive migration policy. Things can get a lot worse.
The employer said, we're going to London. I don't know what is London. I don't know what is look like London. In the Qatar is worse, but here it's more worse. Every day she's shouting, he's hitting.
She keep pushing on my mind that you are just slave for me. I'm always sick, I'm starving.
We work that, it's almost 24 hours. I decided to run.
Every year, thousands of overseas domestic workers are brought to the UK. They cook, clean and look after the children of their employers, who are typically wealthy and from the Gulf states. But they're also tied to them, following changes to the visa system in 2012. This leaves many open to shocking abuse behind the doors of some of London's wealthiest streets and hotels.
In utilising hard border regimes to manage reproductive labour, global North states also reinforce far-right nationalist politics, which attempts to close off the country from foreign invaders.
We are here today because Canada is broken. Our kindness and generosity has given way to naivety and weakness. We do not want to be taken advantage of, tricked, lied to, and sold out by those we trusted to lead us.
But ministers want to crack down on legal migration and say overseas recruitment of care workers needs to end. The government wants to cut low-skilled visas in areas like care and construction by 50,000.
This process itself creates the condition for a deepening crisis of social reproduction. If such workers can't enter the country like Canada, then social reproduction has to be either socialised and degendered, which is, only going to happen through a communist revolution, or women are going to have to be controlled and forced back into the home and their natural role as caregivers. And what that means is a fascist resurgence.
Now to a concerning trend in the labour force. The exodus of women in the workplace is rising at an alarming rate. Take a look at data from the most recent jobs report. It shows 212,000 women aged 20 and over have left the workforce since the start of this year, while men of the same age have added 44,000 workers.
The thing that's going on is daycare is getting really difficult because of the end of some pandemic subsidies. And so a lot of families are looking around and saying, I can't afford this. And one of the parents is going to have to drop out, and it's often the woman.
And I think this tension is at least part of the reason why we have seen an erosion of women's and queer rights over the past few years and an intensified descent into fascism. The border, the the increasing racialization and the hard racial regimes which are being produced by bordered organisation of racialised and gendered labour, is creating the conditions through which those borders have to be closed. And this happens in combination with the requirement to fill in care gaps, which are increasingly undermined, and because what the patriarchal logic of global care chains isn't abandoned but reinforced. If you can no longer import care, you have to reaffirm patriarchal divisions of labour within the national setting. You have to control women's bodies. You've got to reinforce heteronormative family dimensions, which means attacking anything which lands outside of that. Non-nuclear family forms, gender politics which break gender binaries, queerness, all have to be attacked. And I think that's one of the reasons why the twin features of the development of fascism are migration politics and gender politics. And a final point worth mentioning about the increasing reliance on migrant women to facilitate the care gap within the global north is that just as social reproductive labour is exported to racialised migrants, so too are their social reproductive responsibilities exported back home to the countries and families from which they came. The global care chain links low-income women oppressed by race, caste, class, and sexuality and nationality to their employers, privileged by those same hierarchies in the advanced capitalist countries of the global north and increasingly also in the global south. In turn, migrant workers' own families, often forbidden from accompaniment, are cared for by other family members or other chains of domestic workers. So, just as this iPad is the product of chains of production differentiated through racial global divisions of labour, resulting in massive upward flows of value towards the imperial core, global care chains have facilitated relatively higher values of global north labour power while exporting the reproduction of labour power further and further down the chain. Just this last week, British Home Secretary, is she now the Foreign Secretary? There's been a reshuffle since I wrote this. I think she's the Foreign Secretary now. God, politics moves fast, like a bullet. British former Home Secretary Yvette Cooper announced that she will stop refugees in Britain bringing family members over to join them. Moves like this further entrench divisions between families, pushing familial reproduction to occur across borders and across continents. And what I think is extremely important to grasp from this very brief sketch of global care chains is not only that our entire imperial mode of living allows us to consume commodities like iPads kept cheap through violence, but fills the gap in the reproduction of our very lives through the barely hidden violence of borders. Yet the unceasing cannibalistic tendencies of capital continue to erode the foundations of this reproduction, or the intensification of racial supremacist, nationalistic social relations through hard border regimes. Hard borders are essential to neoliberal capitalism, but they perversely produce fascistic, anti-migrant politics which push to fully exclude migrants that are essential to the systemic reproduction of capitalism itself. And this hard border fascism is only going to intensify as climate catastrophe produces more and more refugees. Crisis, piled on crisis, piled on crisis. And the only way to defend against this oncoming storm of border fascism is not, as Novara shithead Anand Bastani recently did, to run interference on behalf of English nationalists accusing a cartoon of being anti-white racism. This is our left. This is the media left in this country. It's fucking embarrassing. Nor do we need to acquiesce to the legitimate concerns of anti-migrant voices, but we need to steadfastly stand against border regimes. We need to work to abolish the border. But not only that, we need to organise for the collectivisation and degendering of social reproduction alongside organising against capitalist production. Stopping fascism for good means stopping capitalism and its cannibalistic self-destruction. So long as capital dominates our lives, will it unendingly consume the very foundations of life itself, both politically and ecologically, both productively and reproductively. Alright, thank you for watching. I hope you've all enjoyed this video. Remember to like and subscribe hit the bell, I guess. A lot of people seem to be not getting notified when I post new videos, so if you see this and you're hearing this, remember to get notified. Share the video with as many people as possible. Last few videos have done very poorly, so let's hope that this one bucks that trend. As ever, sign up to my Patreon if you can, or a one-off donation via PayPal or Ko-fi is much appreciated. You can also become a member of the channel. Members and patrons have the same sort of benefits. Early access to videos, patrons get access to all the scripts for all the videos, and $5 and up patrons get access to a Discord server, and $10 and up patrons get their names read out in the credits, so I'll just do that now. Demo Squid, Dying of Thirst, Soval Hayes, Daniel Swing, Earl Grey T, Bonnie, Joshua Moldenhauer, Nina G Public Relations, FD Signifier, Quint Wolf, Kim Crawley, Anita Anispi, Ellis Wren, S, Hey Joe, Cameron Blakemore, Paul, Jacob Quinn Schenker, Mason Colbert, Alex, Tim, Unoriginal Name, Rachel Ann, Melanie Estes, Layum, Xander Corvus, Pia Westfall, Jack, TB Skyen, Christopher Poff, Morgussie, Tom Price, Cade Soiree, Esoteric Fictionalism, Robin, Rachel Mixon, Duncan Skinner, Niels Abelgard, Tinfoil Pancakes, Kieran Gore, Aga Ghost, Barney Carroll, Joel, Daniel Hughes, Nelly Zacheva, J. Fraser Cartwright, Aaron, Tamash Kispiter, and Paul Singleton. And yeah, thanks for watching once again. I will be trying to plough more time into videos. I've had a slightly challenging time over the summer, which I guess I may talk about at some point, but unlikely to, frankly. But for now, as ever, thanks for watching. Share, like, subscribe and all that bollocks, and I love you. Bye. Bye.